Hallie, a jury just found Kouri Richins guilty of killing her husband after about 3 hours of deliberations. She was found guilty of all 5 charges against her, including aggravated murder, attempted murder, 2 counts of insurance fraud, and forgery. In closing arguments today, the prosecution said Kouri Richins killed her husband Eric by giving him a Moscow Mule and possibly a lemon drop laced with fentanyl, and also claimed that she wanted his money and wanted to be with another man.
It started with a story meant to help children heal. A gentle book about loss, written by a grieving mother trying to comfort her 3 sons after their father's sudden death. But behind that story was another one no one saw coming, because just weeks after she went on television, smiling softly as she spoke about grief, police showed up and arrested her for his murder. Not a stranger, not a random crime, but a husband found lifeless in his own home with a lethal dose of fentanyl in his system. So high, investigators would later say, it wasn't just enough to kill, it was meant to make sure he never woke up. And as detectives began to dig deeper, what they uncovered didn't look like a tragic accident. It looked like planning, text messages that didn't match the story, secret meetings that raised questions, and online searches that would send chills down anyone's spine, and a timeline that suggested this may not have been the first attempt. Then came the twist that shocked the country. Because while the investigation was quietly building in the background, she was building something else in public, a book, a children's book, about grief, about losing a father. And the question that began to haunt everyone who followed the case was simple, but impossible to ignore. Was this the story of a grieving wife trying to survive an unimaginable loss? Or the story of a woman who created the loss herself and then tried to control the narrative that followed? Because by the time this case reached the courtroom, the truth would be argued, challenged, and dissected in front of a jury, and what they ultimately decided would change everything. If you want more real stories like this, raw, shocking, and fully uncovered, make sure you subscribe and stay with me till the end, because what really happened inside that home and what came out during those 13 days in court is far more disturbing than anyone expected. The moment the courtroom doors closed behind the jury, everything about this case shifted from speculation to judgment. But to understand how it got there, you have to go back to the beginning, before the headlines, before the arrest, before anyone even imagined that a quiet home in Kamas, Utah would become the center of a murder investigation. In early March 2022, everything about the Richins family looked normal. From the outside, it was the kind of life many people envied. A growing real estate business, a beautiful home, 3 young boys, and a couple that, or at least publicly, seemed to have built something stable together. But behind that image, things were already starting to crack. Friends would later describe a relationship that wasn't as perfect as it seemed. There were tensions, arguments about money, about control, about the future. And while those close to them saw glimpses of it, no one could have predicted what was coming. On the night of March 3, 2022, nothing appeared out of place. According to statements later given to investigators, the couple spent the evening together at home. At one point, they shared drinks, something casual, something ordinary, a Moscow Mule, a lemon drop shot, a small moment that, at the time, meant nothing. But that moment would later become one of the most heavily scrutinized parts of the entire case, because just hours later, in the early morning of March 4th, Eric Richins was found unresponsive. Emergency services were called, efforts were made, but it was already too late. He was pronounced dead in his own home. At first, there was confusion, but not suspicion. There were no obvious signs of violence, no break-in, no immediate reason to believe this was anything other than a sudden, tragic loss. A husband gone, a father taken too soon, and in those early hours, the focus wasn't on questions, it was on grief. Kouri Richins, now a widow, was seen as someone facing the unimaginable. A mother of 3 suddenly left to explain to her children that their father was never coming back. But as the investigation quietly moved forward, something began to change. Because when the autopsy results came back, they didn't match the picture everyone had accepted. Eric Richins didn't die from natural causes. He died from a drug, not just any drug, but fentanyl, and not a small amount. Investigators would later reveal that the level found in his system was roughly 5 times what is considered lethal. This wasn't something that could easily be explained away. It wasn't accidental exposure. It wasn't a minor overdose. It was something far more serious. That was the moment everything shifted. What had once been a tragedy became a potential crime. And naturally, the question that followed was one investigators ask in every case like this. How did it get into his system? Because Eric Richins wasn't known to be someone using fentanyl recreationally. There was no clear history that could explain it, no obvious source, which meant one thing. Someone had to have provided it. As detectives began retracing the final days of his life, they started looking closely at the people around him, and especially the person who had been with him that night, his wife. At this stage, nothing had been proven. There were no charges, no public accusations. But quietly behind the scenes, investigators were building a timeline. And what they found would raise more questions than answers. Phone records, movements, communications, small details that, on their own, might not mean much, but together started forming a pattern. Then came something even more unsettling. Evidence suggesting that this may not have been the first time something like this had happened. Just weeks before Eric's death, on Valentine's Day, there had been another incident. According to testimony later presented in court, when Eric had eaten a meal, a sandwich, and shortly after he began to feel extremely ill. Not just uncomfortable, but like something was seriously wrong. He reached out to friends, telling them he felt like he was going to die. But he didn't. He survived that day. At the time, it was brushed off. Maybe food poisoning, maybe something minor. Nothing that triggered a full investigation. But after his death, that moment would take on a completely different meaning, because prosecutors would later argue that it wasn't random. It was an attempt, a failed one. And if that was true, then what happened in March wasn't sudden at all. It was the second try. Now investigators weren't just looking at a suspicious death. They were looking at a possible pattern, an escalation. And as they dug deeper, they began to uncover another layer of the story, one that had nothing to do with what was happening inside the home, but everything to do with what was happening outside of it. Because while Eric Richins was alive, the couple's financial situation wasn't as stable as it appeared. On paper, there was success, real estate deals, business activity, growth. But beneath that surface, there were serious problems. Debt, pressure, a business that, according to later testimony, was beginning to collapse rather than thrive. And if that wasn't enough, there were also signs of something else, a separate relationship. Messages would later reveal that Kouri Richins had been communicating with another man, someone she spoke to about a different future, a life that didn't include the one she was currently living. Individually, and none of these elements proved anything, but together they started to form a picture, a strained marriage, financial stress, a possible alternative relationship, and a sudden death caused by a substance that didn't belong there. By the time investigators put all of this together, one thing had become clear. This wasn't going to stay a quiet case. And as the months passed, what started as a private tragedy would slowly turn into a public investigation, one that would soon explode into headlines across the country. Because just when it seemed like the story had settled into silence, something unexpected happened. Something that would shock everyone watching from the outside. And it didn't come from the police, it came from her. Because while investigators were quietly building a case, she was building a story, not for the police. Well, not for the court, but for the public. About a year after Eric Richins died, something unexpected appeared. A children's book, soft colors, gentle words, a message about loss, healing, and how a child can cope after losing a parent. It was presented as something deeply personal, a mother trying to help her sons understand grief after their father's sudden passing. And on the surface, it worked. She gave interviews. She spoke calmly, carefully. She positioned herself as a woman trying to rebuild her life after tragedy. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like strength. But behind the scenes, investigators were seeing something very different. Because while she was talking about grief publicly, they were uncovering evidence privately that suggested something far more calculated. And it started with something small, but incredibly important. Phone data. As digital forensic analysts began going through recovered information, they found search queries that didn't align with the image being presented. Searches about fentanyl, about lethal doses, about how poison shows up on a death certificate, about deleting messages, about how investigators recover deleted data. Individually, each search might be explained away, but together, they painted a very different picture. Not of someone grieving, but of someone preparing. And then came the next layer. Investigators began looking into how fentanyl could have been obtained in the first place. Because Eric wasn't known to have access to it, there was no clear reason for it to be in his system. That's when they found a connection. A house cleaner who had worked for the family. According to testimony later presented in court, this house cleaner said she had been asked multiple times to obtain pills. Not prescriptions, not something from a pharmacy, street drugs. She described meeting a man at a gas station in Draper, Utah. Not once, but multiple times in early 2022. And when investigators checked phone location data, it confirmed something critical. On specific dates, February 11th, February 26th, and March 9th. Both phones were in the same place, at the same time, right at that gas station. Those dates weren't random. They lined up with the timeline leading directly up to Eric's death. Now the case was becoming more than suspicious. It was becoming structured, a timeline of events, a possible source of the drug, and digital behavior that suggested knowledge of what that drug could do. But there was still one key question left unanswered. How was it given to him? Because no one saw it happen. There were no witnesses, no recordings, no direct moment captured. And that's where the prosecution introduced a theory that would become one of the most debated parts of the entire trial. They pointed back to that night, the drinks. According to Kouri's own statement, the couple had been celebrating a small success in her real estate business. They had shared alcohol, something normal, something harmless. But prosecutors argued it wasn't harmless. They suggested that after the failed attempt on Valentine's Day, she had learned something. A sandwich could be noticed. It could taste off. It could be rejected. But a drink, a quick shot, a cocktail. By the time someone realizes something is wrong, it's already in their system. And that, prosecutors argued, is exactly what happened. A lemon drop shot, a Moscow Mule, delivered in a way that wouldn't immediately raise suspicion. But the defense pushed back hard. They argued that this was just theory, not evidence. That there was no direct proof fentanyl had been placed in any drink. That the prosecution was filling in gaps with assumptions. And that became the central tension of the case. Not just what happened, but what could be proven. Still, the evidence kept building. Deleted messages between key individuals, a financial picture that was worse than anyone initially believed, her real estate business, described by a forensic accountant as imploding, with a net worth of negative $1.6 million just one day after Eric's death. And then the life insurance, policies totaling around $2.2 million, including one that prosecutors argued had been applied for fraudulently, containing errors, inconsistencies, and even what a forensic specialist suggested was a forged signature. The narrative the prosecution was building was becoming clearer. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't random. This was planned. But just when it seemed like the case couldn't get any more intense, something surfaced that would take it even further. A handwritten letter, found inside a jail cell months after the arrest. According to prosecutors, the letter laid out a fake story, a version of events that shifted the blame away from her and onto Eric himself. A claim that he had asked her to obtain drugs for him. But there was a problem. She had never told investigators that before. Not during the initial interviews. Not during the investigation. Only after being arrested. Prosecutors argued this wasn't a new truth. It was a new strategy. An attempt to rewrite what had already happened. But the defense saw it differently. They argued that investigators had already made up their minds, that they weren't interested in evidence that could point in another direction, that the case had been built on assumptions from the very beginning, and that everything, from the house cleaner's testimony to the digital searches, was being interpreted in the worst possible way. By the time both sides had finished presenting their arguments, the courtroom was left with two completely different versions of the same story. One of calculated planning, financial desperation, and a final act meant to secure a way out, and another of gaps, assumptions, and a case that, according to the defense, never truly proved how Eric Richins died. After 13 days of testimony, over 40 witnesses, and a mountain of evidence, both direct and circumstantial, everything came down to one final moment. 8 jurors, one decision, and a question that had followed this case from the very beginning. Was this a tragic accident that had been misunderstood, or a carefully constructed crime that had finally been uncovered? The answer would come faster than anyone expected. When the jury walked out of the courtroom, no one knew how long it would take. Days, maybe weeks. That's what people expected, because this wasn't a simple case. It was layered, emotional, complex. It involved technical evidence, conflicting arguments, and a story that had divided public opinion from the very beginning. But then something happened that no one saw coming. It didn't take days. It didn't even take a full day. After just about 3 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. 3 hours. In a case that had taken over a year to investigate, 13 days to present in court, and involved more than 40 witnesses, the decision came down in what felt like a moment, and that alone told everyone in the courtroom something important. The jury was sure. When they filed back in, the room shifted. Every eye turned forward. Every sound seemed to disappear. Because this was the moment where everything, every theory, every argument, every piece of evidence would finally be decided. Kouri Richins sat there waiting, the same woman who had once stood in front of cameras, speaking about grief, now sat in a courtroom, about to hear whether she would spend the rest of her life in prison. The verdict was read. Guilty, not just on one charge, but on all of them. Aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder for the Valentine's Day incident, forgery, 2 counts of insurance fraud, every single count. And in that moment, the entire narrative of the case changed permanently. This was no longer a question. It was no longer a theory. A jury had looked at everything: the timeline, the searches, the testimony, the financial records, notched the alleged attempts before the final act, and concluded that it all pointed in one direction. According to the court, this was murder. As the words were read out loud, Kouri Richins lowered her head. No dramatic reaction, no outburst, just a quiet moment that marked the collapse of everything she had tried to present to the world. Because now, the story she had told publicly, the grieving mother, the author, the woman rebuilding her life, had been replaced by something else entirely: a conviction. And while that moment brought a form of closure inside the courtroom, outside of it, the impact was just beginning. For Eric Richins' family, this wasn't about headlines or public attention. It was about loss: a brother, a son, a father. One of his sisters spoke after the verdict, and thanking those who had worked on the case and focusing on what mattered most moving forward, honoring Eric's life and supporting his children. Because in the middle of everything, 3 boys were left without their father, and no verdict could change that. But even with the decision made, one question still lingered in the background. Why? Because even with all the evidence, all the arguments, all the conclusions drawn in court, the deeper question of motive is something that often stays with people long after the case is over. Prosecutors had laid it out clearly: a woman under financial pressure, a business that was collapsing, a life she wanted to maintain, a relationship she may have wanted to escape, and a belief, according to their argument, that there was only one way forward. But the defense had pushed back until the very end. They argued that there were still gaps, that there was no direct proof of how the fentanyl entered Eric's system, that the investigation had focused too narrowly, too early. And even after the verdict, those arguments didn't disappear, because that's the nature of cases like this. A verdict ends the trial, but it doesn't end the conversation. Now everything moves to the next stage: sentencing, scheduled for May 13th, where the court will decide just how severe the consequences will be. And the reality is, the outcome could mean life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for many people watching, the most unsettling part of this case isn't just the crime itself. It's the contrast. The image of a mother writing a book about grief, while according to the court, no being responsible for the very loss she claimed to be helping her children understand. That contradiction is what made this case unforgettable, because it forces you to ask a question that doesn't have an easy answer. How well do we really know the people closest to us, and how much of what we see is actually the truth? If you found this story as shocking and disturbing as it sounds, make sure you like this video and subscribe for more real cases broken down like this. And tell me in the comments, what part of this case stood out to you the most?